Japan's ruling party on Monday elected Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga as its new leader to replace Shinzo Abe, after the Prime Minister resigned earlier this month citing chronic health issues. Suga is almost certain to be appointed the interim Prime Minister in a parliamentary vote on Wednesday, given the Liberal Democratic Party's majority hold of the seats. Now, the 71-year-old has been Abe's right-hand man for nearly 8 years and said he will follow in his footsteps when it comes to major policies. But it doesn't look like an easy ride, as Abe leaves behind a stagnant economy and, of course, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So to discuss what the next 12 months might look for Japan's presumed new Prime Minister, we're joined by Seijiro Takeshita, Dean and Professor at the School of Management and Information at the University of Shizuoka. Hello, it's lovely to see you.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, and we're also joined by Kim Byung-ju, Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies here in Seoul. It's great to have you on the show again, Dr. Kim.
Great to join you here. Thank you very much.
Well, to dive straight into the issue, let's start with you, Dr. Takeshita. So, Yoshihide Suga appeared to be the party's favourite before the party officials, of course, went to the polls yesterday. But former Defence Minister Shigeru Ishiba, he actually enjoyed a lot of public popularity. So what really was the main reason for Mr. Suga's appeal?
Well, his appeal is smooth transition. I mean, he had been the chief cabinet secretary for almost 8 years under Mr. Abe. So obviously, he knows the people, he knows the methodology, he knows the current situation. Ishiba-san used to get even bigger popularity almost 8 years ago, I remember. So he was a real arch rival of Mr. Abe, but he doesn't really get the support from the factions within the LDP. In fact, Mr. Suga received support from 5 of the 7 major factions within LDP, which means that he has secured a very strong background. And this is quite interesting, considering the fact that Mr. Suga is probably the first Japanese prime minister that is independent, that does not belong to any faction. So basically, it was a very good interim prime minister, as you say. But I think I would say his span might be a little bit longer than what we assume right now.
Oh, well, that's very interesting. Well, Dr. Kim, Suga, as Dr. Takeshita mentioned, is known to be more moderate than his rivals. How do you think he's going to be received by Japan's East Asian neighbours, primarily South Korea and China?
I think on the slightly negative side first, the fact that he has been serving for Prime Minister Abe for so long, almost 8 years, 7 years and 9 months, according to the calculations, as his cabinet secretary, his general secretary in terms of the idea. That probably makes him very much like Abe. A lot of people believe, countries like China and Korea believe. And because he's been so closely tied to Abe, a lot of people believe among the 3 candidates that ran for the new prime minister seat, that they believe, Mr. Suga is the one that is most likely to continue on with Abe's line of foreign policy altogether. And Suga himself has mentioned several times that he's going to continue on with Abe's line, and also he had said that he's going to closely consult with Abe in terms of foreign policy as well. So that has raised concern in the minds of Chinese and Koreans and neighboring countries that Suga will be continuing with Abe's line, not necessarily improving the relationship with the neighbors. But however, on the relatively positive side, many experts have pointed out that Suga himself is not as much as of an ideologue as Abe himself, meaning that Suga is more neutral. He doesn't have as much of a strong belief in history and certain kind of specific perspective on the foreign relations in this region and so on. So he is freer in that sense. So that gives us a little bit more of a hope some of the experts have observed so far.
Well, we'll get back to foreign policy in a bit, but, well, as you mentioned, Suga has emphasised that he will be picking up where Shinzo Abe has left off. But Dr. Takeshita, so what are Suga's immediate concerns? I mean, how well do you think he is going to deal with the COVID-19 situation and the ailing economy?
Alien economy, foreign matters, COVID-19 are all heavily correlated as we speak. And as Dr. Kim has just depicted quite eloquently, one of the biggest concerns that we have is his power on foreign policy. Now, for the time being, he's going to probably sustain Mr. Motogi as current foreign minister because he wouldn't want to have any changes at this point, and also consult, Mr. Abe, et cetera, in order to basically mitigate, his possible weakness. But I think that he looks reserved and he talks in a very conservative method. And of course, he is probably a follower of many of the policy of Mr. Abe. But I think we'll be seeing a positive surprise from him because he's quite a reformist. And he's an independent person in the sense that he's not tied as much as other prime minister in allocation of cabinet members, which we'll be hearing today. Now, cabinet members are often favor return to these factions for making you the prime minister, but as I said, he's independent, so he can have much more freer room of choosing the type of people that he wants. And he's also made it very clear that he only wants people who are pro-reform, which basically sheds a very good, light at the end of the tunnel, because obviously what we really need to see is transitional process, particularly in the third era of Abenomics, which has not been realized, which is structural transformation. And we need a lot of these reform, including a lot of foreign matters and also the policies towards COVID-19 as well. And he's going to introduce Department of Digitalization, for example. So he is going to probably come up with a much more bigger surprises than we initially feel at this moment.
Right, so it's not just going to be a rather vanilla kind of ride. There are going to be some elements of surprise that he introduces there for the better, hopefully. And well, Dr. Kim, when it comes to foreign relations, now Shinzo Abe was a clear nationalist and he has been quite friendly with the likes of US President Donald Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin. So what is Suga's style of diplomacy? Do you think he's going to take a different position or a slightly different position on foreign relations, as well as the issue of Japan's constitutional reform?
I think taking a different take on foreign relations would be a hope for many of the observers in neighboring countries who are hoping for a better relationship with Japan. So that would be a hope. And we'll have to wait and see how it goes. But so far, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Suga has mentioned that he's going to consult closely with Mr. Abe about foreign policy, and the fact that he has been working so closely within Abe cabinet for so long minimize such a hope. But then again, we have to be open-minded about this, as Dr. Takeshita mentioned as well. So he's a reformist, so the reformist attitude or stance could also show its impact on the foreign relations as well. So we'll have to wait and see. The key point we have to keep in mind is, in my understanding, I think Suga cabinet has about a year time before general election. So my guess would be, along with guesses of other observers, is that he may show the status quo, at least for the next about a year time, until he goes through a general election and he becomes, if he's successful, becomes the next prime minister based on popular votes. This time, he became prime minister based on the decision of his party. But, after 1 year, he will get the referendum, if you will, from the people of Japan. And in that case, once he becomes his own prime minister, maybe he would become freer to present his own color and stance and direction in terms of foreign policy more.
And of course, there's a lot of attention on how this will affect regional security. And Suga did emphasize the importance of Tokyo's bilateral alliance with Washington. But he also did mention Japan's relationship with its neighbors. Let's first take a listen to what he said.
There are complex issues between China, South Korea, and other neighboring countries, but it shouldn't be a choice between one or the other. We need to strategically form relationships with these countries and communicate regularly. That's the kind of diplomacy I want.
So, Dr. Takeshita, how do you think Suga government is going to handle relations with neighboring countries like South Korea and China?
I think he has to come with a better agreement, or at least putting people on the table. Partly because, as Dr. Kim had mentioned, if we're going to have a general election next year, he is going to be decided whether he had been an adequate leader or not. And Mr. Aso, who used to be our prime minister and currently our vice minister, made it very clear that if he doesn't have a good performance in the next year or so, then there would be a total revamping of the choice of the prime minister. So he's getting a warning from inside as well. Now, as for foreign policies, again, this is one of the black box, and this is where you really have to tread very, very carefully. But especially at times like this, when we have Brexit EU, the presidential race in the United States, who unfortunately have been collapsing the coalition on the free world side. We've got the North Korean issue, Chinese aggression. All these issues really needs to be put on the table. I think one of the problem that we're facing is that many of the political issues are going to the table by looking at the public opinion rather than having a talk. So this is where I think Mr. Suga has to tread carefully and try to patch up a lot of relations and to reconsolidate the powers in this area to fight off various aggression that we're seeing right now.
And Dr. Kim, Dr. Takeshita just mentioned the North Korea issue here, and Abe, before stepping down, he did emphasize the importance of the issue of Japanese nationals who are abducted by North Korea. How do you think a Suga government is going to handle relations with North Korea?
Abe's case, Prime Minister Abe has mentioned throughout his career about his concern and his commitment of making improvements in terms of the Japanese abductee issues were taken to North Korea. So that has been his lifetime political issues for Abe. But Suga's case, even though he's been serving Abe as his cabinet secretary for many years, he himself does not seem to have, at least in my understanding, as much of commitment to the issue as well. So he might be, Mr. Suga would be freer in a way than Mr. Abe in terms of dealing with this issue and also dealing with North Korea as well. Then again, my own independent individual personal observation or prediction would be that since he has a general election coming in about a year time, he may not try as much of a dramatic measures in terms of improving relationship with North Korea. That would probably come after the general election. But then again, however, after November U.S. presidential election, and if there are things that could happen out of surprise, and if Mr. Suga, Prime Minister Suga faces a need for taking a different gesture or stance towards North Korea, Suga being a kind of neutral and more flexible personality than in comparison with Prime Minister Abe, he may also produce some certain surprise moves and so on. But we'll have to wait and see. I think time will tell us what his direction would be.
And before we go, Dr. Takeshita, if Mr. Suga does become Prime Minister, as we're widely expecting, then he will be meeting with the heads of South Korea and China in a trilateral meeting later this year. Do you think it could really then be a chance to turn around relations and go in a more positive direction for regional peace and security?
I'm quite hopeful. This is one of the great things about changes and alterations. You can start anew on relationships, particularly with the new members. So I'd like to think that this could be an igniting point of retrieving back, of having people on the table. Again, I strongly, would like to point out that currently I think the political situation in this arena is looking particularly directly to the public opinion far too much. What needs to be done is you need the delegates, you need the authorities really sit down and talk with each other before they run into conclusions in order to gain popularity or increase their populism within their, voting arena.
Yes, hopefully, as you said, there will be a time to overcome this sort of nationalism and just relying on the polls and opinions, but really taking this rationally, I suppose. This is where we're going to have to wrap up the discussion, I'm afraid. That was Dr. Seijiro Takeshita, Dean and Professor of the School of Management and Information at the University of Shizuoka, and Dr. Kim Byung-ju, Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, right here in Seoul. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow here in South Korea. Have a good day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.